Amen. That's right. King Jesus. That's who we're here to worship. Talking about monarchies. So Queen Elizabeth II died September 8th, 2022. How many of y'all like to keep up with that type of stuff? Anybody in here? All the royal weddings? Okay, Stephen. All right. Only one. It's just you, so you should feel embarrassed. No, I'm just messing with you. Following her death, her eldest son, King Charles III, immediately acceded to the throne. And that stuff's fascinating, just because that's just not how our country works. So it's interesting to us. It's a prestigious role. The one on the throne looms larger than life, don't they? They have a palace. They have wealth. They have all the prestige that comes with a monarchy. Except there's one problem. They have no power. It's interesting. They have no power. They look good. They look powerful, but they can't vote. They can't veto anything. Their role is all symbolic. It's just all tradition. What England does to their monarch, oftentimes the church does with their king. We give him verbal recognition. We make beautiful buildings for him that we call churches. We have people come every Sunday to pay homage to the king, like we read about in Psalm 2. Yet for many, when it comes to decision making, when it comes to veto power in their life, when it comes to authority, we push him to the side and we want to do it our way. We acknowledge his position as king without giving him the credit and the power that accompanies it. But Jesus doesn't need our acknowledgement for him to rule and reign. He is ruling and reigning. He is king. King of the cosmos, king of everything. Jesus is king and he reigns supreme whether you want him to or not. Whether you acknowledge him as king or not. Jesus is king. And in the end, he will get his way. He will get his way. He always does. Today, we continue the battles in the Promised Land with the first battle of the story. This is a famous story, the miraculous falling of Jericho's walls. This is one of those stories that's kind of similar to Noah's Ark, where you get a little children's storybook Bible, which we love, but they don't always paint the real picture of what's going on. Like Noah's Ark, you got the cute giraffes going around, but they forget to show all the dead bodies in the ocean. You know what I mean? So that's kind of how Jericho is. It's kind of how Jericho is. It's an awesome story, but it's also a terrible story, a terrifying story. Terrible in the sense that God's wrath is poured out in a terrifying way. We see God demand genocide as a form of justice on a wicked nation, and it is hard. This is one of the hardest passages in the Bible. If you've spoken with many atheists, they oftentimes point to here, to the violence in the Old Testament, to what they would call genocide, which it is. And so we will begin at the end of Joshua 5, looking at the commander of this army. And then we'll walk through the entire conquest of Jericho, the falling of the walls, the taking of the fortress. In the end, we'll end with the difficult topic of violence in the Old Testament. Why did God demand genocide of people, especially women and children? It's a hard one. This is a hard passage, so we're going to spend our time there. But first off, we need to set the scene with who is in charge. We think Joshua is in charge, but Joshua is not really in charge. There's a commander far greater than Joshua. So let's look at that. Joshua chapter 5, verse 13. When Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua approached him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied. That's crazy. "Neither. I have now come as commander of the Lord's army." Then Joshua bowed with his face to the ground in homage and asked him, "What does my Lord want to say to his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did that. Man, this is an awesome text. This is what we call a theophany, or more specifically, a Christophany. What I mean by that is this is Jesus who he's talking to. Pre-incarnate, meaning before taking on flesh, this is Jesus. This is God he's speaking to. This isn't an angel, some angelic being that was created. This is Christ. And what confirms that here is that Joshua falls to his face and he worships him. And this figure, this commander of the Lord's army, doesn't stop him. When we see angels throughout the Bible, people have experiences with angels. They fall down terrified and they're like, no, get up, don't worship me. That doesn't happen here. Why? Because this is God speaking to Joshua. And then what does he say? The ground where you're standing is holy. This brings us back to where? To the burning bush. Another theophany, another pre-incarnate form where God is cloaking himself to interact with his people and to speak to them. That's what we're getting here. And what this is doing is this is confirming Joshua as a Moses-type figure. So why does God come down? Why does he come down to speak with Joshua? I think there's a couple things going on here. First, I believe it was during this meeting that Joshua receives the instructions for the battle at Jericho. Because as we're about to see, he's about to relay some information to people. And I think it was here that Christ is communicating to Joshua his instructions. Okay, there's no other explanation for this plan in Joshua 6 other than God told Joshua. So when did God tell Joshua? I think it's happening right here. We just don't get that conversation. It makes sense. The second, and more importantly than just communicating a plan, Jesus came to assert his authority over Israel. That's really what's going on here. Jesus came to assert his authority over Israel. Before Israel could conquer Jericho, they needed to be conquered by God. They needed to get to a place of total submission and faith in order to be successful in their future endeavors. And Joshua's response is complete submission. That's demonstrated at this time, as we'll see. They truly accepted God's rule and God's reign over their life because God's going to tell them to do something extremely foolish on the outside, right? Something that requires a lot of faith, and they do it. Submission typically comes natural in the presence of good authority, of righteous authority. Think about grade school. If you were in grade school, did you ever have a substitute teacher that, man, they just couldn't wrangle that class? I was never one of those kids. Wink. I've got some terrible stories, but some of my friends were a lot worse than me. I'll just be honest. Throw them under the bus. But man, sometimes they just couldn't wrangle that class. That class might be acting wild, just out of control. And then all of a sudden, that classroom door swings open. That principal walks in, and what happens? Right? That presence of authority comes in, and everything comes back into order. That's what's happening here. Jesus is stepping in. He's saying, I am the authority. I'm in charge. And this is what is about to happen. His response to Joshua's question should cause us to pause, though. Joshua says, whose side are you on? Whose side are you on? What does Jesus say? Neither. That's crazy. We're talking about Israel here. He says, I'm not on anybody's side. That's not how this works. Why would the commander of God's army, Jesus Christ, refuse to take the side of God's chosen people? Because there's no us versus them in this story. It's not whether God is on your side. The proper question is, are you on God's side? That's what's at play here. It's like God doesn't pick sides. That's not how this works. It's who is on God's side. Have you been conquered by God? That's what's at play here. Have you gotten to a place where you have totally surrendered and submitted to His authority over your life? That's the call of the Christian life. And that should cause the church to sober-mindedness. God's not on our side. That's not how this works. There's a lot of false churches out there. There's a lot of false teachers. There's a lot of churches that are filled with evil. Just because it's a church doesn't mean God's on your side. It's, are you on God's side? That's our call as Kingdom Community Church. We must be on God's side. We must be in total submission to his authority over our lives. Joshua does that. That's what I love about Joshua. He is so quick to obedience, so quick to follow the Lord's plan, even if it seems foolish. Joshua submitted to the commander of the army, Jesus Christ. He chose his side. He picked the side of Yahweh. And then we get the conquest. Verses 1. We'll pick up in verse 1. Now Jericho was strongly fortified because of the Israelites, no one leaving or entering. The Lord said to Joshua, look, I have handed Jericho its king and its best soldiers over to you. So God's promise of victory against Jericho. This was a strong foe, a fortified defense. It was great. It was strong. But here's what's interesting. When we oftentimes come across these stories, we're like, oh, it's this big city. This was a fortress. It was a place where people came to then fight their war. It was really just a mile in diameter. And so when they're just walking about a mile of diameter. And so there's people living outside of this fortress. And there's high walls. You could think archers up there. When war's coming, everybody gets into this stronghold. And then they defend themselves. They have supplies in there. They come in there. They're protected. And they just fight off these people. And it was a stronghold. But what's awesome is God says, you're going to take it. He gives them the outcome before even giving them the plan. He's like, you're going to take this city. You're going to take this stronghold, this fortress. And here's how. I love it. He speaks in the past tense. He's like, it's already certain. This is said and done. It's kind of like when we read Revelation. That's past tense because that's going to happen. Jesus, when he promises something, he accomplishes it. And so he can speak in past tense about future events because he's outside of time. Everything that he promises comes to pass. But in order to see the outcome, Israel must follow the plan. And God has promised, church, he's promised victory for the church. He's promised that there will be people saved. He will bring about salvation of the lost. The kingdom of God will advance. He will accomplish that work. It's said and done. It's promised. It's guaranteed. But he doesn't save people without someone sharing the gospel with them. He doesn't save people without a proclaimer of the good news. That's just how it works. That's how he made his plan to unfold. God has promised that we will see people saved, but it is not accomplished by us sitting on our hands. If we want to see people saved, we've got to proclaim the good news. This is how we take conquest. This is how we expand the kingdom. God accomplishes his work in and through active participation of his people in advancing the gospel. Then we pick up verse 3, instructions for the action against Jericho. He says, march around the city with all the men of war, circling the city one time. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horns, trumpets in front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, while the priests blow the ram's horn. When there is a prolonged blast of the horn and you hear it sound, have all the troops give a mighty shout. Then the city wall will collapse and the troops will advance, each man straight ahead. So Joshua receives instructions from the Lord and then passes those instructions on to the soldiers and the priests. And this was spiritual. This was more spiritual than it was political. This wasn't some earthly action plan. This was a divine plan. God was bringing judgment on those who had long refused him. And he was working on behalf of the people who he had made a covenant with. He was communicating that success was not through human accomplishment. It was not through human power. It was not through human ingenuity. This was going to be a divine intervention. This was going to be God's doing. This event follows the crossing of the Jordan, which is where we were last week, and is showing the people that the same God who led Israel out of Egypt through the Red Sea is the same God that is leading them now. And then Joshua tells the priests and the people what to do. Verse 6, so Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant and have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horns in front of the ark of the Lord. He said to the troops, move forward, march around the city, and have the armed men go ahead of the ark of the Lord. David Guzik says, God could have conquered Jericho and defeated the city for Israel without any participation on the part of his people. Sometimes God works this way, but not on this occasion. He wanted Israel to be part of his work. God often works today after this same pattern, choosing to wait for the active participation of his people before he decisively acts. Think about Sodom and Gomorrah. God decimates it without anybody's help. But right here, he's giving them this specific instruction. Have these soldiers march. Have these priests carry this ark. This is how many you want. Do this, do that, do this. He is wanting the people to participate in his plan to bring about redemption. Verse 8, we see the march then of the 6 days. After Joshua had spoken to the troops, 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns before the Lord moved forward and blew the ram's horns. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. While the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front of the priests who blew the ram's horns, and the rear guard went behind them, behind the ark. But Joshua had commanded the troops, "Do not shout or let your voice be heard. Don't let one word come out of your mouth until the time I say shout. Then you are to shout." So the ark of the Lord was carried around the city, circling it once. They returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning. The priests took the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests, carrying 7 ram's horns, marched in front of the ark of the Lord. While the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front of them, and the rear guard went behind the ark of the Lord. On the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? That there's these priests blasting horns and carrying this ark. That's like central to this. They're going to play no physical part in taking over this city, but he's wanting the Ark of the Covenant and these priests to be central to this entire thing. This was to remind them that this is Yahweh's battle. This is God's battle, not the Israelites. They're to remain silent, it says. That had to be eerie, seeing this crowd. Like, imagine in the city, I don't know what must have been going through their minds. They see these people carrying this box. There's these priests and there's some soldiers that are walking around the city. They blow a horn and they're just silent for 6 days. 6 days. I don't know if that would have been terrifying or if they would have been mocking them. I'm not sure. But they rest. That's what they're doing. They're doing nothing. Remember, it's a mile diameter. It's taking them, 30 minutes to an hour? Then they go back to the camp and they just rest. They do this for 6 days. And there's a contrast here. They march, blow a horn, are silent, and rest for 6 days. And it's on the 7th day that the work happens. And it's God who does it. They follow these instructions step by step. Verse 15. Early on the 7th day, they started at dawn and marched around the city 7 times in the same way. That was the only day they marched around the city 7 times. After the 7th time, the priests blew the ram's horns, and Joshua said to the troops, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." So God commanded this procession around Jericho to take place every day over 7 days. And then this means that the march around the city was going to be on the Sabbath. That final one, they were to march on the Sabbath, breaking normal Sabbath keeping customs. This is a reversing of God's order at creation. When God created the earth and all that was in it, in Genesis 1, he worked over 6 days, moving the universe from chaos to order and then resting on the 7th. And we get a reversal of that happening here. At Jericho, God commanded his people to do their most strenuous work on the 7th day as he completed his work of judgment on these people. The command was given for the people to shout. After days of silence, this was a recognition that God would now give Israel what he promised, conquest of the city. Scholars note the intentional parallel here to creation days. Not only, in this case, the emphasis is upon decreation. You see, there was to be no Sabbath rest for God's enemies. There was to be no rest for them at the end of this sabbatical week. But for Israel, it was the climactic beginning of entering into this Sabbath rest in the land of Canaan, God's promised land. God was bringing judgment, and the wages of sin, death, was going to be poured out on these people of Jericho who in their idolatry had declared themselves the enemies of God. There was no mercy. There was no grace. There was no hope for them except for Rahab. Except for Rahab, this prostitute. Verse 17. But the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and everyone with her in the house will live, because she hid the messengers we sent. But keep yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of those things, you will set apart the camp of Israel for destruction and make trouble for it. For all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's treasury. This is the first conquest, okay? The Lord instructs them, don't take anything. Okay, He allows them to take some things in future conquests. But right here, the first conquest, He is to receive it all. This was to be the first fruits of this. As Joshua 6, 22 through 25 indicates, the Canaanite prostitute Rahab and her family survive. We didn't look at that story in the past, but you could read about this story of Rahab keeping these spies in her home and putting this red thing out to signify that that was their house. And you could go read about that story. But her family survives here. They survive Jericho's fall, and they are incorporated then into God's people, Israel, which is wild. Hebrews 11:31 mentions her in the Hall of Faith and mentions her and says it reminds us that she, Rahab, was saved by faith, by the faith of hiding the Israelite spies in Joshua 2. Rahab believed that the God of Israel would defeat the false gods of Canaan, placing her trust in Him, her faith in Him, and sheltering the Lord's servants. Not being an Israelite by blood, Rahab shows us that saving faith is not bestowed by the right family relation. You're not born into saving faith. Just because you're raised in the church, just because you're brought to church as a kid, doesn't mean you are born into salvation. Your family relation has nothing to do with salvation. It is all by grace through faith alone. God accepts anyone who trusts in Him through Christ alone, no matter their history, no matter what sin they've gone through. Rahab was a prostitute, and she had faith in the Lord, and the Lord saved her. No matter what sin you have in your past, God can redeem you by faith in His Son. Rahab survives. And here's what's even more amazing. If you were to flip to Matthew 1, what you'll see is that Rahab is in the lineage of Jesus. Rahab was saved so that Jesus could come and save you. A prostitute, someone who we would deem unworthy, disgusting, filthy, God saved her and used her to bring about Jesus Christ. In this story, Rahab's salvation is more important than the fall of Jericho and the conquest of the Promised Land, because God was preserving His seed, and He was going to do it through Rahab. Man, why should a prostitute in a pagan land inherit salvation and be everlastingly known as one who lives as a daughter of Zion rather than as one who perished under the rubble of Jericho? Because God's grace is unsearchable. His grace is amazing. That's what's being communicated here. And His justice, though, is nothing to be trifled with. Many people are troubled that God would destroy an entire city. But perhaps the problem is that we think too highly of ourselves and too lightly of the justice of God. The truly baffling part of this story is not that God decimates Jericho. The baffling part of this story is that God saves Rahab. That's the crazy part. That's unreal. She was not worthy of salvation. She was not worthy of salvation. And guess what? You are not worthy of salvation. You should see yourself in Rahab. You are filthy. You have rebelled against God. You are no worse, no better than a prostitute, because that's what you've done with God. You've committed adultery against our God. All of us have. We have rebelled against Him and been unfaithful to Him. We are Rahab. But God saves us despite our sin when we place our trust in Him alone. Our trust in Him alone. His grace will wash us of all of our sin. When we just trust in Christ, it's all washed away and we find forgiveness. And then we are engrafted into this tree, to this story, to these people by faith and faith alone. And then the walls come tumbling down and the city is destroyed in verse 20. So the troops shouted and the ram's horns sounded. And when they heard the blast of the ram's horns, the troops gave a great shout and the walls collapsed. The troops advanced into the city, each man straight ahead, and they captured the city. Success. The first conquest was successful because God was with them. He was the commander of the army here. He was going before them, and He did all of this. They simply followed His instructions, and it bore fruit. But then we get to a really hard passage. Verse 21. They completely destroyed everything in the city with the sword. Every man, every woman, both young and old. Every ox, every sheep, every donkey. Death everywhere. From old to babies. There was not to be any life spared. Donkeys, sheep, ox. That's tough. The Bible has some hard things. Is genocide ever justified? It's a tough passage. How do we discuss the justice of God? Why is it right for God to slaughter women and children? Because it's right for God to slaughter women and children whenever He pleases. That's the truth. He is God. He is in the heavens and He does whatever He pleases. Life, every single life is in His hands. It's in His hands. Every death that has ever occurred is because God did it. That's what we learn in Ecclesiastes. God is sovereign over death. God has the prerogative to remove people from this place and bring them to the next. Only God has that right. That is not unjust. He is God, and He does whatever He pleases. Life and death is in His hands. God alone, Genesis 18 tells us, God alone is a righteous judge. God is just, and He is right, whether we completely understand it or not. Doesn't matter. He's right, no matter what He does. Everything He does is right. Everything He does. To think God is unjust is to assume that we know more things than we actually do. God alone is in a place of righteousness where He can demand these judgments. Okay, by what standard are you judging the God of the Bible? What is your standard for judgment? What is your standard for right and wrong? What do you mean by evil? Who decides what is right and wrong? A better question, I think, is if God is loving, why does He do this? And what's even more difficult in this passage is why does God command it to be done at the hands of men? This severe measure of killing everything was taken to prevent godless elements of Canaanite culture and worship from affecting Israel. We act like breaking the first commandment is not a big deal. That worshiping other gods is not a big deal. We really do. We act like that is not a big deal. That is worse than murder. Worshiping a false god is worse than murder. That's true. And the Canaanites were wicked people. This is like radiation. Okay, you gotta get rid of the source of it, or it's gonna infect things. That's what's happening here. Deuteronomy 18. Let me just flip back and tell you a little bit about the Canaanite culture. God says he was patient with them. He was letting this wrath store up for 400 years. They knew about Yahweh, y'all. They knew about God. They knew about him, and yet this is what their culture looked like. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of these nations. So he's telling them, these are what these nations do. No one among you is to sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery, cast spells, consult a medium or a spiritist or inquire of the dead. Everyone who does these acts is detestable to the Lord. And the Lord your God is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable acts. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. Though these nations you are about to drive out listen to fortune tellers and diviners, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do this. See, this wasn't some arbitrary ethnic cleansing. The Bible highlights this as a very important event in God's rescue plan for the human race. God held back his judgment, it says, for 400 years on the Canaanites. He waited until their sin was full. Okay, Jericho was a fortress. Remember what I said? People lived outside of the fortress. But Rahab she had a home inside. What was that home? That was a brothel. That was her home. And what did people come in there for? For sex worship. These diviners, they say you need to go and lay with this prostitute to please this God so that he can send rain. That's what Rahab was. That's who was inside these places, temple prostitutes. They would sacrifice idols. They would sacrifice children to this idol called Moloch. What was this? This was this bronze statue. This happened in a lot of these places throughout Canaan. There's this bronze statue that had arms out like this. And they would feed it wood. They would burn inside this bronze statue. And they would take their child and they would lay it on the arms of that bronze statue. And then they would beat drums as loud as possible to not hear the cries of those babies. That's what was happening here. And you think it's wrong for God to decimate Jericho? Why? How are you able to judge God's standards? Jesus' story of the tower falling on someone is a great lesson here. We shouldn't think we're better because these things haven't happened to us. God is not against a race or a people group. He judges Israel for this same stuff. If you keep reading, they fall into these same practices. That's why he says, I'm not picking sides. You got to be on my side. God judged his own people even harsher. And they knew God. They knew him. And they still defied him in similar ways. So God used wicked nations to bring similar judgments on them. If you are a Star Wars fan, okay? Switching from Moloch to Star Wars. Got to ease some of this tension here. Luke Skywalker destroys the Death Star, okay? And is your first reaction to something like that happen, the Death Star blowing up, is it to say, oh, but those families? No. No. It's getting rid of evil. Many people ask God, why? Why don't you stop evil? And then when he does, they complain about it. Man, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with lost people. This is what they bring up. So why doesn't God stop evil? And then you tell a story about God stopping evil. How dare he? Who are you to judge God? Israel served a particular purpose as a nation with God as their leader. And they were a tool in God's hand. That's what they were. The nation of Israel was God's tool for enacting justice and pointing people to God. These children were receiving horrendous consequences because of their parents' decisions. God deemed it best to rid the earth of these people so as not to pollute the Israelites. See, God is infinite love. Yes, he is infinite love. He pours out his mercies, but God is also infinite justice. He is infinite wrath. We have a tendency to shy away from the harder things of God. and just focus on the good things, the things that make us comfortable. But God has the right to even decimate us. This makes me fear. This story makes me fear for America, for the future generations here. God doesn't interact with nations in the same way as he did in the Old Testament, okay? Like America's not God's chosen people, all that stuff. He doesn't interact with nations the same way. Yet, we should be afraid. We wince at me telling you the story of them sacrificing babies to Moloch, but we've murdered millions more in abortion clinics all over our country. Man, we had 10,000 babies murdered last year in the homes through abortion pills that are being shipped in to Tennessee. 10,000 babies murdered by a pill in someone's home. 5,000 people left our state to drive to Atlanta to get an abortion and then come back home. The culture is a report card of the church. The culture is a report card of the church. We have become tolerant of the intolerable. Church, we have to do something. We've got to conquer by the gospel. That's our weapon. We have the good news of Jesus. What does this country need? It needs the gospel. Are you going to sit on your hands, church? Or are you going to get out there and proclaim Jesus, the only one who can save people? Are you going to do it? Do not sit on your hands as people are dying and spending an eternity in hell. Please, church, please do not sit idly by as people are out. Man, I've talked to so many people now that I'm at the care center. I sat across from someone this past week that looked me in the eyes and said, I sold my soul to Satan. I performed sex magic for him. That's in our city. These people, there's paganism on the rise. Witchcraft is on the rise, y'all. In our country, in our city. Witchcraft, what I just read about in Deuteronomy 18. And we just kind of sit by. We have the good news of the gospel. It is the only thing that can save anybody. It's the only solution to this problem. We have to get out and proclaim Jesus. We have to. It is how we conquer. It is how the kingdom is advanced. It is how we exercise our faith. Y'all are going to get tired of hearing me talk about evangelism, but I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop. You've got to be brave, church. You've got to be courageous. There are people that have never heard about Jesus in our town. This one counselor at the care center, Paul, sat down with someone who nobody ever told her that Jesus died on a cross and rose from the dead. She lives right here in Cookeville. Never heard that story. We think that only happens in India or in China. That happens right here in our city. And God is calling you to do something about it. So here's my last call for you. Don't break faith. Chapter 7, verse 1. It says the Israelites, however, were unfaithful. Man, they just saw this happen. And right after, they were unfaithful regarding the things set apart for destruction. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of what was set apart, and the Lord's anger burned against the Israelites. There's a dichotomy at play here. Some were faithful. Hebrews 11:30 tells us that this event was accomplished by faith. There were some faithful, yet some were unfaithful. God commanded them, do not take anything, yet some did. These objects were associated with demonic worship and the practices of the Canaanites, and the treasures belonged to God in his house. This word, however, some of your translations start with, but the Israelites is contrasting the verse before it, which is talking about Joshua's fame spreading. It's contrasting their unfaithfulness with Joshua's faithfulness. Joshua was faithful. The leader was doing God's work, yet sin was at work in the people, and the people were going to suffer because of it. It just shows you leadership's important, yes, but the purity of the congregation is of equal importance. You, individuals, make up the whole of this church. When you are unholy, it makes our church unholy. Church, we have to be faithful to King Jesus. We must learn from this, that God takes sin seriously. This word, unfaithful, is communicating the idea of adultery. That's what the word is. They were committing adultery with God. And on top of that, they were stealing from him. God owned everything in this capture of Jericho. To take God's property was theft. And then the thieves would go on to deny it, lying to him. So they committed adultery with God. They stole from him, and then they lied to him. And what does God do? He brings judgment on Israel. Once again, it comes full circle. Whose side is God on? Wrong question. The proper question is, are you on God's side? Are you on God's side? Is Jesus the commander of your life? He better be. Or you will spend an eternity separated from him. Just like Jericho's walls fell, just like they were wiped out. That is the path for those who are not conquered by Jesus. So I want to urge you, if you do not know him, if you have not been conquered by Christ, bow your knee to the King and call out to him, Jesus, save me. And he will. He will. Church, pray with me. God, this is a heavy text. May we feel its weight. As we read your word and we come across these difficult passages, may we not just brush over them and just get to something comfortable. Lord, you inspired this story. You inspired these words. And these were recorded for us so that we could take it up, that we could read it, that we could learn from it, learn about you, learn about how you think about sin, how you think about salvation, and what you are calling us to do and to be. And so, God, we thank you for saving Rahab. In your mercy and grace, you looked at someone unworthy and you washed her and you cleansed her and you made her white as snow. And you saved her so that you could send Jesus to save us. So we worship you, Lord, for your mercy, for your grace, for the salvation that comes in you. Lord, may we be like Rahab and trust in you. Trust in you alone for salvation. May we not be like Jericho, falling into sin. May we not be like some of these Israelites who were unfaithful to you after seeing the amazing miracle that you performed. God, keep us faithful, please, oh Lord. Please help us, God. Please make this church holy, set apart for your good pleasure. Please use us in this community. Oh God, please give our people courage to go out and to proclaim the only message that brings salvation. The good news of the gospel is foolishness to the world. Just like it was foolish for these Israelites to march around a city for 7 days, it is foolish to go out and to believe that just saying a simple story about what you have done will save people. But that is what it does. You've given us the good news, and we are called to be unashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to all who believe. And so may we go forth from this place on this conquest of expanding the kingdom through the Great Commission. May we do it with all boldness, with all love, with all mercy, and with the confidence that you will save. You've promised it, Lord. So we cling to that promise. In Jesus' name, amen.